A few months ago, I did an almost hour-long podcast-type video on the land of Rune, the vast eastern lands of Middle-earth. But Rune is not the only vast, mysterious land in Middle-earth. It has a counterpart to the south, a land of deserts and jungles, a land with strange beasts such as Mumakil and apes, and a land where many types of men mixed, all sharing a history of conquest, war, and oppression. I am, of course, talking about Harad, the south of Middle-earth. So in this podcast video, I'm going to cover the land of Harad, from the early days of Middle-earth to the days of the Fourth Age. And if you haven't seen my Rohan or Arnor or Rune or Duran's Folk podcast videos, I would like to make a disclaimer. This is the type of video that you can treat as a podcast. There will be visuals, but it's not necessary to watch the video. You can instead listen to it, perhaps while you work or work out or play games, or while you're cooking, or while you're commuting, or while you're digging suspicious holes in your backyard that are definitely not body-shaped. Anyway, here we go. I hope you enjoy the ride. In my video on Rune, I may have exaggerated when I asked the rhetorical question, what land is more shrouded in mystery than Rune? Because of course, while much of the history of Rune is blank, there was also quite a lot that went on there. First, we had the awakening of the elves at Cuivienen, then we had the awakening of 4 of the 7 dwarven clans, possibly in the mountains known as Oricani, and finally, we had the awakening of men in the land of Hildorian. So, Rune was home to men, elves, dwarves, even orcs, and eventually dragons, and throughout its history, there was a steady stream of peoples migrating to the lands to the west. In contrast, no one awoke in Harad, so whereas we know quite a lot about Rune's early history, we know next to nothing about Harad's. On top of that, we know even less about the geography of Harad than Rune. We know that it's roughly shaped like Africa, and that the landmass extends far into the south of Middle-earth. However, we know very little about what exists on that landmass. At least at one point, there was a chain of mountains along the west coast called the Grey Mountains, not to be confused with the Grey Mountains in the north. At the time of the Battle of Powers, there was also a chain of mountains in what corresponds to eastern Harad called the Yellow Mountains. Whether either of these mountain chains existed beyond the First or Second Age is unknown. What we do know is what I briefly mentioned before. For example, we know that a lot of the lands of near Harad were dominated by hot deserts. In far Harad and beyond, we know that there were dark forests, probably another name for jungles. That said, the climate and environments were not always so extreme, as we're also told that there were, well, regular fields in Harad. In these lands lived animals that couldn't be found anywhere in the westlands of Middle-earth. I'm talking Mumakil, oliphants, which were used in battle by the Haradrim. There were also camels in the deserts, and apes that could be found in the jungles. In many of the regions of Middle-earth, elves or dwarves were usually the first inhabitants, but Harad is an exception to this. There's no record of there being elves or dwarves in Harad either in the early years of the First Age, or even into the Third Age. That said, given there's so much of Harad that we don't know about, it's possible that elves and dwarves did make their way there, to explore, or possibly even to live. But our first confirmed people to live, at least for a time, in Harad, were the House of Halef, and their Druidine companions. Unlike the ancestors of the House of Beor and the House of Hador, who passed through the north of Middle-earth, the ancestors of the House of Halef made it to the Westlands by circling south of Mordor and then crossing the Anduin there. While we know many of the ancestors of the Haladin would end up settling in the lands of Gondor, Calenadon, and Eriador, where they would be known as the pre-Numenoreans, we're unsure if any stopped before the Anduin. If some did, they probably got absorbed into the next group that arrived, the Haradrim. I say group, but it's important to know that Haradrim or Southrons, like the Easterlings, did not refer to a single specific group, and was instead a broad term used to describe any man from Harad. Some of the Haradrim that we're exposed to clearly aren't of the same ethnic group. For example, we have the tall, dark, gold and scarlet wearing Haradrim who appeared during the War of the Ring. But we also have a group described as troll men, black-skinned with white eyes and red tongues. Whether these men were actually related to trolls, or whether they're just described that way because they were so alien to the men of the north is unknown. Unfortunately, apart from the Haladin passing through, we pretty much know nothing else about the lands of Harad during the First Age. While Morgoth's influence was mostly in the north and east of Middle-earth, he did exert influence over many, if not most groups of men, so it's likely that although the men who moved to Harad weren't as deep in the worship of Morgoth compared to those who dwelt in the east, they probably, at least nominally, served the Dark Lord. But with the fall of the Dark Lord at the end of the First Age, many groups of men did manage to break free of his influence. Given they were far from Morgoth's old power bases, the Haradrim might have been among them. What also may have helped was the return of the Numenoreans in the early Second Age. Led by Viantir, the captain of the ships under the reign of Tar Elendil, the Numenoreans started making journeys back to Middle-earth, firstly in the north. But in 750, Prince Aldarion founded the Guild of Venturers, and the exploration of the coastlines of Middle-earth accelerated. Between 725 and 877, Aldarion himself made 9 journeys to Middle-earth, the longest of which lasted 14 years. During these years, he explored far down the coastline of Middle-earth, presumably to the most southern reaches of Harad, and on one of his journeys, he narrowly avoided being shipwrecked off the coast of Harad. At first, the Numenoreans came to these lands as friends and gift-givers. They instructed the men of Middle-earth in the arts of agriculture, stonemasonry, and smithing, and the men of Middle-earth prospered from this exchange and began to view the tall men from the sea as gods. But the Numenoreans were not the only force that were active. Sauron and his emissaries also went amongst the native men, instructing them in similar things, although always gearing them towards war. Due to its large coastline and due to its proximity to Mordor, where Sauron now based himself, the men of Harad were probably central in these silent wars of influence. The dynamic in Middle-earth changed with the forging of the Rings of Power. Sauron, now uncovered by the elves, prepared for war, and although most of his power and preparations were in the east, he undoubtedly still had servants in the south. At the same time, the Numenoreans had begun to colonize down the coast, near to the Anduin, and possibly even beyond. Sauron dared not to assail them, but in his attack on the elves during the War of the Elves and Sauron, he drew forth armies from Numenor. At the Battle of the Gwathlo in 1700 of the Second Age, Sauron was crushed and fled humiliated back to Mordor. There was peace for a time, but the victory over Sauron had an effect on the Numenoreans. They realized the true measure of their strength, and generation by generation, they started to look upon Middle-earth as a resource to be exploited, rather than a land to be explored. This started with Tar-Kiryatan, who became king in 1869. He built a great fleet of ships and started to siphon wealth and metals from Middle-earth, oppressing the native men in the process. Harad, close to Numenor and with a long coastline, was no doubt at the forefront of Numenor's exploitation, and the Haradrim began their long, complicated feud with the men of the West. Things weren't going great inland either. Sauron had been forced away from the coasts, so he redoubled his efforts into the interior of Middle-earth. Once again, much of this would have occurred in Rhûn, but undoubtedly also in Harad. During these years, Sauron also handed out 9 rings of power to mortal men. 3 of the receivers were Numenoreans, 1 was an Easterling, and of the remaining 5, it's likely that at least 1, and possibly several, hailed from the vast lands of Harad. Trapped between Sauron on one side and an increasingly tyrannical Numenor on the other side, these years were known as the Dark Years for the men of Middle-earth, and the men of Harad were not immune to that. Over the next few centuries, the Numenorean colonization of Harad continued. In 2280, a haven which had been built in the northern parts of Harad was fortified and named as Umbar. This was the northernmost fortress of the king's men, those Numenoreans who questioned the ban of the Valar and were falling into shadow. That said, there were many other Numenorean domains to the south, where they built great fortresses from which they oppressed and exploited the native men, and where they built great tombs filled with the wealth that they had stolen. Late in the Second Age, Sauron began to attack these Numenorean dominions along the coast. A wave of these attacks coincided with the reign of Ar-Pharazôn, who had usurped the crown from his cousin, Tar-Miriel, in 3255 of the Second Age. But what truly enraged Ar-Pharazôn was that Sauron was calling himself King of Men. So, in 3261, Ar-Pharazôn landed a massive army at Umbar. He marched around for 7 days before setting up camp and sending forth messages that demanded Sauron's fealty. Sauron, realizing that he could not defeat the Numenoreans by force, elected to come alone and swore fealty to Ar-Pharazôn. Sauron, as cunning as ever, realized that he could destroy Numenor from within. That said, the following years delivered no respite for the men of Harad, and in fact, it just got worse. After Sauron had corrupted Ar-Pharazôn and most of Numenor, the methods of the king's men Numenoreans became even worse. Instead of just subjugating and exploiting the men of Middle-earth, they also began enslaving them, hunting them for sport, and even sacrificing them on the altars of Morgoth. The memory of the kindly kings coming out of the sea had faded, and now the natives of Middle-earth would flee when they saw sails upon the horizon, and the fortresses of Numenor upon Middle-earth grew stronger, and many of those who commanded them were already loyal to Sauron. Numenor, in this awfully corrupted state, would only last a few more decades. In 3310, Ar-Pharazôn's fear of his approaching death got the better of him, and at Sauron's council he resolved to attack Valinor, believing the Undying Land would give him undying life. In 3319, his massive fleet and army was ready, and it sailed into the west, but upon stepping ashore, Ar-Pharazôn and his army was buried beneath the hills, and his fleet, and all of Numenor itself was sucked into the abyss of the ocean. Numenor was gone. But Numenor had plenty of remnants upon Middle-earth. In the north, Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, founded Gondor and Arnor, the realms in exile, and in the south, the Kingsmen Numenoreans had plenty of domains such as Umbar. Most, if not all of these domains, were ruled by Sauron loyalists such as Harrimar and Fuiner, and the Kingsmen Numenoreans there would become known as Black Numenoreans. Thus, for the time, the Haradrim were not yet free of the yoke of the Numenoreans. Sauron had also survived the downfall of Numenor, and in secret, he'd regathered his power in Mordor. He had always had the allegiance of those men who lived in close proximity to Mordor, but with the downfall of Numenor, he could now call upon vast power from Harad, not just the native Haradrim, but also the Black Numenoreans. In 3429, he launched a surprise assault on Gondor, beginning the 12-year-long war that would be called the War of the Last Alliance. But Sauron overestimated his own strength and underestimated the strength and unity of his enemies. In 3441, he was defeated, he lost his one ring, and the power of Mordor was vanquished for a time. This, of course, resulted in changes in Harad. The Black Numenorean dominions had once been supported by Numenor, and afterwards they were united in their service to Sauron. Now that Sauron was gone, it began to fall apart. Some of the domains warred upon each other, perhaps trying to create a successor to Numenor. Others rulers gave in to decadence and luxury, and their strength and influence decayed. The result was the same for most of them. In the early years of the Third Age, they were overthrown or absorbed by the Haradrim that they had once oppressed. Let's talk about the Haradrim for a moment. Once again, I want to say that this is a broad term for many peoples who happen to come from the same place. And I also want to say that, like the Easterlings for example, our perspective of the Haradrim comes mostly from the perspective of the Gondorians and from other peoples in the Westlands. Thus, even though I'm talking about Harad, a lot of the video will come across as Gondor-centric. That isn't to say that their perspective is wrong. They describe the Haradrim as a cruel, martial people, and we do see some examples of that. They also say that even though they, the Gondorians I mean, and the Haradrim were never friendly, they did at least have dealings with each other. The reason I'm talking about this is that we don't really know how the Haradrim felt about Gondor in the early Third Age, because unlike the Easterlings who immediately started attacking Gondor, the Haradrim did not. They probably had their hands full with the decay and then destruction of most of the Black Numenorean dominions, and interestingly, unless the histories of the Third Age are leaving out major events or context, then the wars between Gondor and Harad were actually started by Gondor. During the reign of King Siriondil of Gondor from 748 to 830, Gondor began extending its territory west of the Anduin into western Gondor, but also south of the Anduin, probably into Horondor, South Gondor. This was done by the Crown Prince Taranon, and when he took the throne in 830, he also took the name Falastur, meaning Lord of the Coasts. Taranon was also famous for marrying Beruthiel, a black Numenorean woman from south of Umbar. The reason for this marriage isn't exactly known, but it was probably for diplomatic purposes, perhaps a way to ensure peace between Gondor and the black Numenorean realms to the south. But the marriage failed miserably and Beruthiel was exiled for being awful. As a result, Taranon died childless and was succeeded by his nephew Eärnil in 913. Eärnil immediately started gearing up for war, repairing Pelargir and building a massive fleet. The target was Umbar. At the time, it was still ruled by black Numenoreans who were seemingly in alliance with the Haradrim who lived around them. In 933, Eärnil attacked Umbar by land and sea, and successfully captured the city. On a hill above the city, a pillar was built to immortalize Ar-Pharazôn's humiliation of Sauron. So began Umbar's history as a Gondorian city, but those black Numenoreans who survived the loss of their city were not about to give up that easily. They fled into near Harad, and gathering supporters from amongst the Haradrim, they besieged Umbar in 1015, and although they could not take the city, they succeeded in killing King Ciriandil. For many years, they besieged the city, but Gondor was able to keep the city reinforced and resupplied thanks to its powerful navy that was uncontested on the seas. In 1050, Gondor finally struck back. King Ciriahur had equipped a large, powerful army, and bringing it south both by land and sea, he crossed the River Harnen and crushed the Black Numenoreans and their Haradrim allies. The Black Numenoreans of Umbar were finished, and would trouble Gondor no more. As for the Haradrim, those kings that had sided with Umbar were forced to pay tribute to Gondor, and their sons lived as hostages in the court at Osgiliath. Gondor also annexed plenty of territory, taking all the land inland to the River Harnen, and all of the coastline down to Umbar and the Great Cape that sheltered it. Gondor had reached the height of its power, and had reached its greatest territorial extent. Ciriahur would take the name Jarmendikill, meaning South Victor, in honour of his victory. These parts of Harad were wealthy, thus Gondor became exceptionally wealthy too, to the point of where it was said that precious stones are pebbles in Gondor for children to play with. This was not without consequences, for the wealth and power that Atanatar Alcarin inherited, he was Jarmendikill's successor, made him lazy, and much like the Black Numenoreans of Harad centuries earlier, Gondor also started to fall into decay and decadence. It did not help that Atanatar's son, Narmakil, and his nephew, Kalmakil, who would be kings after him, inherited the same disposition of laziness. It's said that by the end of their reigns, the enemies of Gondor were starting to notice the cracks in that mighty kingdom. That being said, there was little activity from the Haradrim. They were either content with their current position, or simply knew that they stood no chance against Gondor. These were the years in which Gondor presumably had plenty of dealings with the Haradrim, certainly not as friends, but at least in a way that constant war could be avoided. For example, there were things like exchanging hostages, and probably trade as well. As a result, in the centuries that followed, most of the action against Gondor was once again in the east. Places such as Horondor and Umbar, now part of Gondor for centuries, became absorbed into Gondor as important parts of the realm. This was doubly true for Umbar, from which Gondor could project power into the lands both south and east. Fortunately for the Haradrim, they would get major help in throwing off the Gondorian shackles from the Gondorians themselves. I'm of course talking about the Kin-strife, a Gondorian civil war which would play a major part in the history of Harad. In 1366, King Valakar assumed the throne. Valakar was a good king, but he had one major problem: his son, Eldacar. Specifically, the fact that Eldacar was half Northman on account of Valakar marrying the Northman princess Vidumavi. As Valakar's reign reached its end, parts of his kingdom were already on the verge of rebelling against him. These rebels were led by a man named Castamir, who was also descended from the royal line of Anarion. Castamir was captain of the ships, so Gondor's fleet was under his command, and he wielded a great deal of influence in Gondor's coastal provinces and major ports such as Pelargir and Umbar. So it's unclear if it was all because of Eldacar's parentage, or whether the rebellion was just an opportunistic play for power by Castamir and the more southern provinces that were more loyal to him, and wanted primacy over places like Anorion and Ithilien. Whatever the exact reason, in 1432, Valakar died and the rebellion kicked off. In 1437, Eldikar was besieged in Osgiliath and was forced to flee the city, which was sacked. He fled to his kinsmen and allies in Ravanian, and in 1447 he returned with an army, supported by loyalists from Numenorean and Ithilien, who were enraged with Castamir's cruelty and his mistreatment of the inland provinces. At the Battle of the Crossings of Erwi, Castamir was defeated and he was slain personally by Eldikar. But the rebellion was not over. Castamir's sons escaped to Pelagir, where the fleet was docked, and they sailed south to Umbar, where they set up a rival realm in direct opposition to Gondor. The loss of Umbar was a disaster for Gondor, not just because it was a powerful, wealthy city, but because, as I said earlier, from Umbar, the kings of Gondor could project power over Harad. With the loss of Umbar, the Haradrim seemingly broke their tributary status, and war in the south was inevitable. Eldikar could do little about this. Gondor had just emerged from a 15-year-long civil war, and on top of that, he had lost pretty much the entirety of his fleet, and the rebels in Umbar could use this fleet against Gondor. Thus, they became the first iteration of the Corsairs of Umbar, who would trouble Gondor for many years to come. While we don't know if war restarted during Eldikar's reign, we know for certain that it raged during the reign of Aldemir, his son, and in 1540, Aldemir was killed in battle with the Corsairs and the Haradrim. He was swiftly avenged by his son, Vinyarion, who in 1551 crushed the Haradrim, and as a result, also took the name Jarmendikill. We know very little about the details of this war, but we do know that despite the victories of Jarmendikill II, Gondor was not able to establish supremacy over Umbar and Harad once again. We know this because in 1634, only 13 years into the reign of Menadil, the son of Jarmendikill II, the Corsairs, led by Angamate and Sangahyando, the great-grandsons of Castamir, raided Pelagir, deep in Gondorian territory. Menadil was in the city at the time and was killed during the raid. His son, Telemnar, swore vengeance and began building a fleet to end the Corsair threat once and for all, and to bring Harad back into the fold. But merely 2 years into his own reign, the Great Plague struck, and he and all of his children died. As for the Great Plague itself, while it's never specifically mentioned that it hit Harad, it almost certainly did. The reason for this is that Gondor was said to have been so weakened that it would have easily been overrun had its enemies not suffered the same losses. While we know Rhûn was hit, it seems that if Harad was not hit, the Haradrim and the Corsairs could have attacked Gondor during this time with great success. Instead, they also went silent for the next 170 years or so, which would imply that they were also recovering from the effects of the plague. While the reign of King Torondor is mentioned as being peaceful, we know that the Corsairs became active again in the reign of King Telummatar, who took the throne in 1798. Telummatar bore a special hatred for the Corsairs. The death of Menadil had not been avenged, and the Corsairs now raided his coasts as far west as Anfalas. Telummatar finished the work that Telemnar had started, assembled a fleet, and in 1810 he stormed Umbar. In this attack, the last descendants of Castamir were killed, ending the threat of the Gondorian rebels for good. To commemorate his victory, Telummatar added the name Umbardakil, Umbar Victor. But Telummatar's victory was hardly secure. Gondor now held Umbar, but there's no mention of them holding the coastline of Harad. So as far as we know, Umbar was a lone fortress in a sea of enemy territory. And, unlike in the past, Gondor did not have the resources to hold such an isolated place. The city survived while Gondor remained unthreatened, but in 1856, shortly after Telummatar's death, the Wainrider Easterlings assaulted Gondor. King Narmakil II was killed during the Battle of the Plains, and Gondor withdrew from beyond the Anduin. In this time of turmoil, Gondor was unable to hold on to Umbar, and the city was taken by the Haradrim. Fortunately for Gondor, who might have had to face a war on two fronts immediately afterwards, the Haradrim rapidly devolved into wars and feuds of their own, possibly thanks to finally having Umbar to themselves. No joke, despite Umbar existing in Harad for 3,000 years, this was the first time the city was actually in the hands of native Haradrim. Unfortunately for Gondor, this changed in 1944. The Wainriders, who had defeated Gondor at the Battle of the Plains in 1856, but had then been defeated by Gondor at the Second Battle of Dagorlad in 1899, now rallied for a final assault against Gondor, and to ensure success, they managed to form an alliance with the Haradrim. Although, notably, we're told that at this time Umbar was not available. Either whoever controlled it did not choose to ally with the Wainriders and other Haradrim, or they had no forces to spare. But with the Wainriders attacking from the east and the Haradrim from the south, it seemed like victory would be assured. To counter the threat, Gondor split its forces into two armies, the larger northern army led by King Ondahur, and the smaller southern army led by General Eärnil. The northern army was defeated at the disaster of the Morannon, but the southern army succeeded in ambushing and destroying the Haradrim near to the crossings of the Poros. General Eärnil then hurried north, rallying survivors of the northern army, and in Ithilien he managed to ambush the Wainriders, effectively ending both threats to Gondor. The Watchful Peace began shortly afterwards. During these years, we don't know what was going on in Harad, other than the fact that they did not attack the northern lands during this time. It would be worthwhile to reflect a bit on how Harad had changed throughout the Third Age, though. While the inland areas were seemingly always controlled by the Haradrim, the coasts had been Black Numenorean. Then the Gondorians had seized the coastline of Near Harad for around 600 years, until the Kin-strife saw an independent rebel realm arise in Umbar. Although this rebel realm was finally destroyed by King Telumtar, Umbar fell into the hands of the Haradrim shortly afterwards. And what was one of the Haradrim made up of at this point? The land had been home to the native men, the Numenoreans, the Black Numenoreans, the Gondorians, and their offshoots that were loyal to Castamere. It's quite possible that if your family had dwelt in Umbar for generations, they were a mix of different peoples with different beliefs originating from Harad itself, or as far back as Numenor. They might have at one point been servants of Sauron as either Black Numenoreans or Haradrim, or at one point they may have fought against him in wars like the War of the Last Alliance. But speaking of legacies, if there was one lasting legacy upon Harad from Numenor, it was shipbuilding. We know this because when the Watchful Peace ended in 2460, the Corsairs returned. The original Corsairs had been rebel Gondorians, thus it's no surprise that they were good at building ships, but the centuries of Gondorian and Black Numenorean control had resulted in the Haradrim also learning how to build powerful seagoing vessels of their own, and these ships didn't just launch from Umbar, but also from other unnamed havens further to the south, far out of the reach of Gondor. At this time, the Haradrim of Umbar, the new Corsairs, only launched raids, but these were effective in their own way. Gondor had a long coastline, and thus resources had to be diverted to defending this coastline, lest the Corsairs terrorize the inhabitants there without any ramifications. This meant that when other major threats appeared, such as the Balkoff Easterlings, Gondor could not draw upon its full strength, and in this specific example, it could only rely on its northern army to venture into Calenadon to fight the Balkoff invasion. That said, the Corsairs had the capability to launch far more than mere raids. In the middle of the 28th century, their attacks increased. One such attack in 2746 resulted in the death of the unnamed 15th Prince of Dol Amroth, but the major assault came in 2758. 3 large fleets that had taken years to build set forth from both Umbar and Harad. Most of these ships attacked Gondor, but some even sailed as far north as the rivers Eisen and Lefnwy. There, they joined forces with the Dunlendings, who were in the process of attacking Rohan. Fortunately for Gondor, Beregond, the son of the Steward, was the greatest captain Gondor had seen in centuries, and over the course of several months he eliminated the invaders. Although the attack on Gondor failed, it did prevent them from sending aid to Rohan. Attacked in the west by the Dunlendings and Corsairs, and attacked in the east by the Easterlings, Rohan was overrun and would have been destroyed if not for the onset of the long winter. This caused the invaders to suffer as much as the Rohirrim did, and in the following spring, Gondor was able to send aid to liberate Rohan. Although war never truly ceased, there were no known major invasions from Harad and Umbar for the next century, but we're told that when Turin II became steward of Gondor in 2882, the Haradrim became active once again, and according to Gondor, they were stirred up by the emissaries of Sauron. During this time, Harondor, South Gondor, which had been a debated land for over 1,000 years, was finally fully occupied by the Haradrim. But the Haradrim were not keen on stopping there and set their eyes on Ithilien. This was still Gondorian territory, but only a few people remained there. Nevertheless, Steward Turin was determined to defend it. Fortunately for Gondor, Rohan had recovered its strength over the past 120 years, and King Folkwyne was keen to pay back the debt that Rohan owed Gondor for their aid following the Long Winter. He sent many soldiers, led by his twin sons Fastred and Folkred, and at the crossings of the Poros, Steward Turin threw back the Haradrim invasion. Unfortunately, Folkred and Fastred were killed in the battle, and a burial mound was raised on the shores of the river, and the Haradrim feared to pass it. Only 70 years later, Sauron officially declared himself in Mordor. Although the Haradrim were perhaps independent in name, Sauron's influence had never truly gone away. As I said earlier, it was believed that Sauron may have had a hand in many of the attacks upon Gondor that came from Harad, and it seems that many of the Haradrim were eager to serve him once again. For example, in Umbar, the white pillar that was a monument to Sauron's humiliation at the hands of Ar-Pharazôn, which had stood for around 2,000 years, was finally thrown down. As the end of the Third Age neared, it became clear that Sauron was marshalling all of his forces for another great war. While the Gondorians could see naught in the east and in Mordor itself, they at least had more eyes on the activities of the Haradrim and the Corsairs. This was especially clear to one named Thorongil, Aragorn in disguise, who served in Gondor in the 2960s and 2970s. He counseled Steward Ecthelion II that the Corsairs were the greatest threat to Gondor because they could strike directly at Gondor's fiefs and thus rob the Anduin frontier of important men and resources. Around 2979, Thorongil finally got his permission to strike first from the Steward. He gathered a small fleet, and they managed to sail to Umbar without being spotted. Reminiscent of the descendants of Castamir raiding Pelargir and killing King Menardil, Thorongil's fleet attacked Umbar at night and burnt many of the Corsairs' ships, and Thorongil himself slew the captain of the haven in the fighting upon the harbour. Then the Gondorians withdrew, having suffered only a few losses. Interestingly, instead of returning to Gondor where he would have received a hero's welcome, Thorongil instead journeyed into the lands of the south and east, where he explored the hearts and minds of the many different types of men that lived there. How effective Thorongil's raid on Umbar was and how much it set back Sauron's plans isn't known, for 40 years later, on the eve of the War of the Ring, Umbar had rebuilt its fleet. The main fleet was at least 50 large ships and countless smaller vessels, but this was only the fleet that could be found at Pelargir, and we know that the Corsairs landed other troops further up the coast. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. On the eve of the War of the Ring, the Corsairs and the Haradrim were ready to go, and would make up a huge part of the assault upon Gondor. From Boromir's report at the Council of Elrond, some Haradrim even participated in the opening battle of the War of the Ring, the first battle at Osgiliath on the 20th of June 3018. But we get our first proper glimpse of the Haradrim in Ithilien. Gondor no longer defended the crossings of the Poros in southern Ithilien, but the Ithilien Rangers, operating from the secret stronghold of Hennef-Annwn, still contested the region. On the 7th of March, 3019, a convoy of Haradrim, including fearsome Mumakil, is ambushed on their way to the Black Gate and are completely annihilated. It's during this battle where we get a touching piece of inner monologue from Sam, although it's spoken by Faramir in the films. He wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would not really rather have stayed there in peace. Once again, I would draw attention to the fact that, yes, while the Haradrim were many times the unjustifiable aggressors, we don't have their perspective, and it makes you wonder, were they truly as cruel as the Gondorians believed? Or were they victims in their own way too? Sorry for that brief detour. This was of course only a small portion of the forces that Harad had committed to Sauron. Many had already breached the Black Gate and were camped in Mordor. Others were still on their way north. When the Morgul host set forth, they were joined by 18,000 Haradrim, including cavalry, footmen, and Mumakil, led by a chieftain who went under a black serpent banner. Many more Haradrim were in reserve, including the frightening trollmen of Far Harad. But the biggest threat was again the Corsairs. Gondor at this time did not have the navy to match the Corsair threat, and the lords of the southern fiefdoms knew it. Even though Minas Tirith and the line of the Anduin needed every soldier that could be spared, the fiefdoms still had to defend themselves. Thus, when Denethor did call for aid, many of the fiefdoms sent only a few men. Lossarnach, for example, sent only 200 when 2,000 were expected, and some fiefdoms, such as Lebanon, sent no men at all. On the 11th of March, the Haradrim saw action across Gondor. In the east, the Haradrim were amongst the Morgul host that had assaulted Osgiliath, and by the next day, they were helping to attack the forts of the Ramesakor that surrounded the Pelennor fields. On the 13th, the Pelennor was overrun and the siege began the next day. The Mumakil of Harad were crucial in dragging the siege towers and siege engines into position to assail the walls. But it wasn't just at Minas Tirith where the Haradrim were fighting. Also on the 11th, some of the Haradrim had landed as far west as Linhir and were fighting the Gondorian forces there led by Lord Angbor of Lamadon. Before this battle could be decided, Aragorn arrived with the Oathbreakers and the Haradrim fled east, hotly pursued by Aragorn and his Wraith host. By the 13th, Aragorn had reached Pelargir. Pelargir had already been captured by the main fleet of the Corsairs, 50 large ships and countless smaller others. Presumably, any defences that Gondor had at the Ethir Anduin had been easily swept away. The initial plan for the Corsairs was to take Pelargir and then sail north to assist in the capture of Minas Tirith, but the plan had already gone awry. Those Haradrim fleeing the Oathbreakers had already brought word of the terrifying foes pursuing them eastward. Some of the Corsairs, not wanting to take any chances, were already pulling away to sail further down the river or to escape to the far shore. However, many of the Haradrim held their ground. They were a large army, and perhaps many did not believe the tales of the Oathbreakers. Unfortunately for them, they were horribly wrong. Aragorn arrived and unleashed his undead army upon them. We don't know if the Oathbreakers could visibly harm, because it wasn't necessary. The Haradrim immediately broke and either fled south on foot or tried to swim across the river. The remaining Corsairs suffered the same fate. The Oathbreakers entered Pelargir and swept onto the ships, and those that remained dove overboard in fear and panic. By the end of the day, there were no enemies remaining at Pelargir. The great army of the Haradrim was no more, and the Corsair fleet was now in Gondorian hands. Meanwhile, the other Haradrim at Minas Tirith played a large role in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, which took place on the 15th of March. Thanks to their surprise attack, the Rohirrim very quickly won possession of the northern half of the Pelennor Fields, but the southern half of the fields were still overrun by enemies. Chief among them were the Haradrim, led by their chieftain who carried the Black Serpent banner. Spotting the standard of King Theoden, he gathered his own horsemen, and the drawing of their scimitars was like the glitter of stars. What followed was perhaps the greatest cavalry battle of the war. The Haradrim charged, but King Theoden and his Rohirrim were not about to wait for them and charged as well. Although the Haradrim had the numbers, the Rohirrim had the better skill and their forces cleaved through the mounted Haradrim. Theoden was in the vanguard and he killed the chieftain of the Haradrim with his spear, and then used his sword to kill the banner bearer, and then used it again to cut down the Black Serpent banner. At that, many of the remaining Haradrim horsemen, outmatched and with no commander, fled the field. But the Haradrim were still a major obstacle in the battle. After the death of Theoden and the destruction of the Witch King, Eomer came across Eowyn and, thinking that she was dead, led his Rohirrim on a suicide charge deeper into the Southron forces. Although this had initial success, it quickly began to turn into a disaster. The Rohirrim were outnumbered 3-1, and although they were superior to the Haradrim horsemen and could easily ride down their footmen, the Rohirrim had no answer to the Mumakil. Their horses would refuse to go near them, so the Haradrim forces could rally about them and use them as staging grounds. And to make matters worse, Gothmog, the new commander of the Morgul host, unleashed his reserves from Osgiliath. This included Easterlings, Variags from Khand, a land to the northeast of Harad, and the aforementioned trollmen from Far Harad, men of the likes of which the Rohirrim had never seen. These new reserves cut off the Rohirrim from the Gondorian forces that were sallying forth from Minas Tirith to aid them, and from the perspective of the Free Peoples, things were about to get worse. The Corsairs of Umbar had arrived. Except, we know that the Corsairs had been destroyed. Instead, Aragorn and his forces from southern Gondor arrived, and the battle turned entirely in favour of the Free Peoples. The Morgul host was eradicated over the course of the day, but the fighting was still long and hard, mostly because of the Easterlings and the Haradrim, who refused to surrender or flee and fought to the death. We're told that few of the Haradrim returned to Harad, and instead, what returned was a rumour of the wrath and terror of Gondor. The Haradrim were not yet finished in the War of the Ring. On the 25th of March, the host of the West, led by Aragorn, reached the Black Gate of Mordor, a suicide mission to distract Sauron from the threat of Frodo and the One Ring. Among Sauron's forces were the Haradrim. When Sauron was destroyed, most of them fled eastwards. Some who were deepest in Sauron's service, or most hateful against the West, gathered themselves for a last stand, and others threw down their weapons and surrendered. When the last of the Easterlings and Haradrim were subdued, the forces of the host of the West then entered the north of Mordor and began throwing down Sauron's fortresses there. With the final destruction of Sauron, it would finally be right to say that the Haradrim were free, perhaps not ideologically, but at least physically. No more masters, whether it be Black Numenorean, Numenorean, Gondorian, or Sauron, and we're told that in the months following Sauron's destruction, some made the most of their newfound freedom and sent embassies to Gondor and to King Elessar. Maybe this was due to the fear of Gondor, maybe it was because not all of the Haradrim truly hated Gondor, we don't know, but at least in those days, some of the Haradrim did make peace with Gondor. But this peace was not all-encompassing, nor was it eternal, because we know that there were still wars to be fought in Harad. As we're told, the forces of Rohan would join Gondor in wars fought in the far fields of the south until Eomer grew old. We're also told that Umbar wasn't subdued until the days of King Elessar. This might have been attained through peace, but it's also possible that during Elessar's reign, Gondor fought a war against Umbar and conquered it once again. After all, it was originally a Numenorean city. But just like everywhere else in Middle-earth, we don't know what happened in Harad deep into the 4th Age and into the 5th Age and beyond. However, what we do know is that eventually, as the ages went on and the world changed, some of the lands that made up Harad would have become places in our own world, perhaps places like the Middle East and the vast lands of Africa. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Honestly, I kind of surprised myself when writing this script, because I assumed that given how much Numenor and Gondor interacted with Harad, there would actually be a lot more to talk about than, say, Rhûn. In the end, these scripts ended up being very similar in length, because even though the Haradrim were in much closer proximity to the Easterlings, we actually know very little about the land itself, especially in the early years. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and I'm going to make the exact same joke as I made in the Rhûn video. If you ever feel lazy, just remember elven cartographers looked at an entire landmass, shrugged their shoulders and just went, south. That'll do.